Now, I would like to introduce our first speaker this afternoon, who is my dear friend, Emily Apter. Emily is a Julius Silver Professor of Comparative Literature and of French Literature, Thought and Culture at New York University. Emily's widely read writings on translation and world literature have shaped the way we think about these notions, while giving an increasingly important role to the idea of a politics of untranslatability. This key concept appears in part 2 of her The Translation Zone, published in 2006, translated in French in 2015. And then it becomes part of the title of Against World Literature on the Politics of Untranslatability, published in 2013 by Verso. The political as such is what Emily resolutely focuses on in Unexceptional Politics, also published by Verso in 2018, where politics is diffracted and analyzed through the prism of terms like micropolitics, impolitic, psychopolitics, or serial politics. In addition to her editorial involvement in the English edition of the Dictionary of Untranslatables, published in English by Princeton University Press in 2014, Emily has written an impressive number of articles and essays on questions as varied as Baudelaire's Politics of Distributive Injustice, 2022, or the concept of corporate persons and its obscure ties with anti-abortion politics, also 2022, for the online journal Philosophy, World, Democracy. And before I hand the floor to Emily, I just want to mention that she has also played a key role in some of the most pressing debates about reading. For example, by co-authoring the afterword to a special issue of Representations in 2009, which was titled The Way We Read Now. The title of Emily's talk is Reading Fore with an E. So please join me in welcoming Emily.
The reading, referred to as such as a hallowed theoretical practice, was well prepared for by traditional hermeneutical protocols, often modeled on biblical exegesis. It took shape as an autonomous field of literary studies and post-structuralism in the 1960s. Techniques of reading became objects of study in their own right. Meanwhile, in art, the poetry reading became recognized as a kind of performative crossover genre, at once interpretive praxis and staging of voices and experimental modes of address. This audience-centered reading found its academic correlative in Germany in reader reception theory, thank you so much, presided over by people like Hans-Georg Gadamer, Herbert Jauss, and Wolfgang Iser. I'm doing a kind of little overview. I'm at the beginning. I'm sort of setting this up, but some of you will go way back historically. I'm sort of from the 60s and then diving in and out in moments from then. So here we could say with reader response, textual infrastructures were assigned a distinct agency, often flush with the persona of the implied reader or the text's transparent mind. That was Dorrit Cohn's famous term. This led to texts being examined for their cognitive programming function, their power to orient, direct, and distract reader response. Though a far cry from behavioral determinism or the predictive processing of contemporary computational intelligence, one could say that reader response criticism anticipated or even reinforced some of those trends. From the 60s on, and I'm just taking a few, Prague School, Chomsky, Saussurian semiotics, much of it very well represented at Brown, also left its mark on the reading, you were talking about the article. The focus here was on discursive structures as signifying systems that produced effects that could be tracked to specific figures of speech and formalist paradigms. In 1962, Umberto Eco published The Open Work, a theory of textual cooperism that shifted modal logic theory, coming from Kripke and David Lewis's analysis of the logic of utterances and the relativism of their reference in relation to possible worlds, to a kind of possible world theory of reading. Here, author, text, and reader produced a semiosis of readings that were neither fully foreseen by authors, nor fully solicited by textual strategies, nor fully delimited by the ideological persuasions and fantasies of readers, but collectively actualized by all of them in the formation of a possible world. So we think of this as cooperative, collaborative, and not having any kind of fixed identity. The semiotic square, remember those? Sometimes called the Greimas square, in reference to its appearance in A.G. Greimas's 1966 Sémantique structurale, was an influential experiment in mapping conceptual binary oppositions and their diegetic resolutions. This narratological formalism, complete with grids and arrows, would be tested out by literary semiologists on literary texts, and one quintessential example, of course, was Roland Barthes' 1970 SZ, which was a kind of a mapping of Balzac's Sarrazin. By the mid-70s, though, reading started to shift in disposition and affect. Inflected by the writings of Derrida, Paul de Man, and Barbara Johnson, among others, deconstructive analytics displaced the tidy diagrams of structural narratology. It laid tripwires on the reader's path, baffling synthetic argument, spurring what I think of as a kind of ontology of reading that reveled in the open work of tropology and in nexes of symptoms. It prompted lexiocentric approaches to all manner of text, cultural object, effet du réel, aesthetic principle, philosophical problem, or even form of media. Taking their cue, cultural studies, queer theory, and post-colonial criticism extended these approaches into a politics of contrapuntal reading that was reparatively for communities marginalized by sex and gender, excluded by virtue of class domination, colonization, and racial onticide. And the names that come to mind are Edward W. Said, Henry Louis Gates, D.A. Miller, Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick, Hortense Spillers, Gayatri Spivak, Homi Bhabha, Jacqueline Rose. The list you can all add to. It's a long one. But I would say that each in their way repurposed the genre of the reading, even as they subjected many of its basic moves to thoroughgoing critique. Now, in the current era of autofiction, social media, and very niche audiences, the reading as a self-justifying critical project shored up by institutional pedagogies has, I think, lost its position as a stable anchor of interpretive practice. This story has been told most recently by John Guillory in Professing Criticism. At the current pass, one could say the question of address that Peter already brought up right away, the to whom the reading is for, and also for, F-O-R-E, in the sense of pre-prepared for, and I was thinking here the whole time of Roland Barthes' Préparation du roman. This has become increasingly complex. So I'll now turn to an analysis of some of the reference points for what I'm arguing with, along the way, Peter Zendi's Sovereign Reading, Michel Ciauli's Something Speaks to Me, with its anti-foundationalism towards the reading in critical pedagogy, and Fred Jameson's last book, The Years of Theory, and Xian Nai's Gimmicky Reading. So I'll consider in each case some of the ways in which reading, you could say, is destined for and for with an E. In Pouvoir de la lecture de Platon au livre électronique, which I think is coming out, or is it out? Powers of Reading from Plato to Audiobooks. Peter contextualizes the era of big data management and distant reading, in which the material impact of the text delivery system often defines the parameters of where and how reading happens today or doesn't. The elitism of reading is in principle diminished with enhanced medial accessibility, but it's also reinforced as shortened attention span and siloed algorithm-driven text marketing further stratifies class hierarchies. These are some of the tensions that form the backdrop of Peter's investigation of the micropolitics of reading mediated by digital platforms. Rather than bemoan the consignment of novel reading and bibliomania to the dustbin of history, he trains his focus on the biorhythms of reading, the life breath of its scansions, its scales and speeds, or technologies of distribution mediated by the inflationary effects of what he calls booktubers, influencers, and readathons. Powers of Reading at first seems to approach reading quite diagnostically. He uses the term auscultation, conjuring a doctor placing a stethoscope on the chest of a patient to measure the heartbeat, making of reading something of a body, thinking one, examined as an eye-brain-ear exchange system that depends on silent vocalization or its noisy counterpart, reading aloud, or process of mouthing words as you read. And that made me think of Flaubert's gueuloir, his habit of yelling while reading. He described this in a letter to Louise Collet, sometimes tossing the pen which he held in his hand into a large oriental tin plate filled with carefully sharpened goose quills. He would take up a sheet of paper raised to the level of his gaze and leaning on an elbow, declaim its contents in a loud, biting voice. Listen to the rhythm of his prose, stop as if seizing a passing cadence, combine the tones, eliminate assonances, place the commas with exact knowledge, like the halting places on a long road. It almost made me think of the Calvino, this kind of journey. Reading is a syndrome associated with distinctive physical behaviors and symptoms, as well for Zendi as a distinct form of psychic life connected to flights of fancy, stirrings of the unconscious, and above all, encounters with absent others. These can be friends or the dead or anonymous persons who deposit their annotations and underlinings on the page like so many mouse droppings or clues. The book's primal scene describes such an encounter. Zendi is perusing Derrida's copy of Giorgio Agamben's Temps qui reste in Princeton's Firestone Library, where the Derrida Library is housed. His eye alights on a comment placed by Derrida next to a phrase in which Agamben calls deconstruction un messianisme bloqué, a blocked or aborted messianism, which Agamben's translator of this text, Patricia Daly, renders a thwarted messianism, a suspension of the messianic. Derrida retorts in the margin, tu débloques, you unblock. Now, Zendi chooses not to weigh in on what this might mean, but the anecdote challenges the reader to parse it. And this is not so easy. Was Derrida accusing Agamben of unblocking messianism because, as a writer steeped in scriptural language and possessed of a kind of church father demeanor, Agamben had opened the floodgates to a messianism that Derrida, despite his own Talmudic fondness for what Sixus calls syntactical amphibology, and playful, she characterizes him as the Jewish saint, that he took pains to keep at bay. Interpreted another way, one could say that Agamben's charge of blocked messianism echoes Walter Benjamin's weak messianic power or force, Kraft, burden of past trauma that escapes historicization, a recessive signal of agency and potentia, whose weakness is redemptive to the extent that it carries something revolutionary and unrealized into the profane realm of historical materialism in the everyday. So instead of being negatively taken as an accusation, Agamben's blocked messianism or deconstruction, conceived paradoxically as the messianic without messianism, as Sami Khatib puts it, that might well be something to aspire to, especially insofar as it proves capable of blunting the retributive strike force of divine justice. But Zendi doesn't litigate the match between Agamben and Derrida over the stakes of deconstructive blockage. He treats their standoff between more like a passage in a Platonic dialogue or performance of the Lectio Divina, which involves reading scripture aloud and praying with the text. And he also shows us that memoed to a third ear, namely his own, his reading ear, the score of Derrida's rejoinder, delivered not face to face but on the page, comes off as a hauntological reader's report. And of course, haunting is an important dimension of reading, according to Zendi. The enslaved amanuensis in Plato, forced to read aloud for those who listen, haunts, quote, implicitly in the inward practice of modern readers as they are individuated and gendered through their very act of reading, quote. This haunting theme also harks back to Derrida's obsession with Marx's hauntology in Spectres of Marx. One of his famous tropes was the gespenstige Gegenständigkeit, the ghostly objecthood of the commodity fetish. And the reference here to das Gespenst underscores a kind of animate immateriality that would carry over not only to Freud's theory of the fetish, a secular shiny object exerting sovereign force over the fetishist, but also to theories of the text, especially the lyrical text, that inculcates the reader in regimes of reception and address. Peter's preoccupation with the haunted reading took me back to Barbara Johnson's analysis of the trope of apostrophe in her essay, Apostrophe, Animation, Abortion. Here she writes, a direct address of an absent dead or inanimate being by a first-person speaker, citing Shelley's "Oh, West Wind, the breath of autumn's being." And she describes it as a form of ventriloquism, through which the reader throws voice, life, and human form into the addressee, turning its silence into mute responsiveness. Apostrophe is the giving of voice, the throwing of voice, the giving of animation. Then a poet using it is always, in a sense, saying to the addressee, "Be thou me." The rhetorical dissection of apostrophe is familiar enough, but Johnson makes a rather mind-blowing swerve to abortion as she turns to Gwendolyn Brooks's poem, The Mother, in which abortion is dressed apostrophically. The line is, "Abortions will not let you forget." Noting that the subject of the sentence is the word abortions, which thus assumes a position of grammatical control over the poem, Johnson poses the unsettling question, with obvious relevance to the present-day legal furor over gestational temporality. What indeed is the debate over abortion about? This is Johnson, if not the question of when precisely a being assumes a human form. Johnson's apposition of apostrophe and abortion makes perfect sense as a critical framework for examining the way US states and anti-abortion activists rely on prosopopeic modes for calling and calling out abortions. Sometimes the addressee is the so-called unborn, a subject personified but not yet person, to whom a claim of legal personhood has been ascribed, with often full rights-bearing powers and entitlements. Sometimes the call is addressed to a term I'm sort of playing around with in another project, the contracepted. These are legions of imagined beings foreclosed by contraceptive methods or deprived in the eyes of especially anti-abortion activists of the opportunity to become a fertilized egg or ensouled embryo. This preconceived unborn was also, you could say, very indirectly evoked by Derrida's in his reading of Artaud's Theater of Cruelty, where Artaud alludes to a pre-birth form of life, une vie avant la naissance, which stands in itself for an unrepresentable ontological origin. In each case, you could say the vocative address conjures a being before itself, unborn or standing before the reader as a proleptic natality. And we could have a long discussion about Hannah Arendt's very weird invocation of natality as part of a whole theory of the human condition, but I won't touch on that now. Instead, extrapolating, I would say that we could perhaps hypothesize that an apostrophic precondition underwrites all reading, insofar as reading is understood, as I think Peter understands it, as an address to absent beings, sounded out through techniques, sometimes of aloud, but also through a term he uses, aphonic or aphonic voicing. You could say that reading apostrophe rhetoricizes abstract figuration, endowing impersonal, non-living entities, including ideas, with anthropomorphic properties and distinct personae. This capacity to personify in one's head through reading confers a huge power on readers. And it's perhaps to rein in that power that the institution of the sovereign reading comes in, establishing conventions of genre that regulate patterns of address and keep the fictive I and you, as I think you already mentioned, from being confused with I and you. It's a kind of control of the flight paths of how signs circulate. So you could also say that now, at the beginning of the 21st century, the critical reading, as if it's still really an established practice, is trying to push away from the sovereign reading into and towards a non-sovereign reading marked by aleatoriness or the aleatory and indirection. Tim Buse, who I'm happy to say is here, has given us a way of thinking about this reading space because I think it aligns with his notion of a post-fictional space of free and direct. Here, and I quote Tim, dysfunction is asserted in place of character when a protagonist identifies structures of thought in which she no longer resides, when a narrator doubts the authenticity of the experience he's narrating, and when a category or space of meaning is invoked not as a distinct contribution of the work to a larger project of understanding or a transmissible series of insights, but on the contrary, as a problem. Sorry, long quote there. Free indirect, I think, lines up with a deep personified thought figure, dedicated to his term again, unthinking relationality, and aware of its own implication or subsumption in the intransitive act of theorizing. Buse qualifies free indirect as a thinking entity whom the reading might be supposed to reconstruct. So where before one could say critical reading ventriloquized absent others by means of a conjuring trick like personification or apostrophe, now in this Buse realm of, and according to his subjunctive reading of Lukács's theory of the novel, there is only, and I quote again, a ventriloquy of the abstract form of the novel were the novel to articulate its own thought in theoretical terms, terms of which novels themselves, in all their concretion, are both blissfully unaware and have no need. And interestingly, I think Barbara Johnson reaches a similar place of critical reading by leaving the poem to apostrophize its own abstract lost state. She reads Baudelaire's Moesta et erabunda, sad and vagabond, as a case of what she calls a kind of drained rhetorical animation and abandoned lyric. And I'll just read the last line. The poem thus enacts in its own temporality the loss of animation it situates in the temporality of the speaker's life. At this point, it launches into a new apostrophe, a new direct address to an abstract lost state. For both Johnson and Bue's radical deanimation and free indirect apostrophic address afford a certain freedom from the sovereign reading. At least that's how I read them. The reader's invited into the wild of a non-self-referential world and allowed to roam freely through structures of thought. Insofar as this kind of reading is hypothetical and proleptic, it becomes a kind of preparatory exercise for something that will never come to pass or come out fully articulable. One could even say it's aborted. This latency and incompleteness captures what I think Barthes was after in his seminar in the preparation of the novel. Some have speculated that his likely objective was nothing more than a plan for his own novel, which he called the Vita Nova, but that he never intended to write it. As Thomas Claire proposed, and this is cited by Kate Briggs, the Préparation should be read, quote, as a work of conceptual art, whose final outcome was subordinate to the documentation of a mental process, especially since the sole outcome of the lecture course was the preparation. That is, the lecture course itself. Throughout, Barthes emphasizes preparatory gestures. And also, it's very, I think one of my favorite parts of that seminar is how he sets up his own space, the space to write, which, writing itself entirely gives way to the space. So there's the setting up home, where you choose the place, get the things you need. Then inside that, you get the proximus space, you work that out, where all objects are within reach, armchair, bed, table, and finally the desk, sometimes swapped out for the bed, which represents, quote, a localization of functions and connections between microfunctions. This is Barthes. For example, the writing surface, lighting, writing instruments, paper clips, blank index cards, written index cards, papers stapled together, a lock, etc. So the structures of home, study, and desk serve as architectural exteriorizations of a scene that Barthes carries with him wherever he goes, a scene of writing for, F-O-R-E, that doubles as a means of writing for himself. He characterizes this complex, borrowing a formula from Nietzsche, as the writer's casuistry of egoism, associating it with the practical issues that are knotted around the ego, and with the imperative of someone who feels he must write, quote, to organize his writer's ego, scribens, on the basis of a systematic set of calculations or life traits. Barthes' elevation of writing for and for me is not as narcissistic as it might initially seem. It takes as its model the Japanese haiku, cast as a non-appropriative form of writing that, quote, belongs to everyone, in the sense that it can seem as if everyone's writing them, in that it's plausible, says Barthes, that everyone could be writing them. Like desire, it's passed on, circulates, takes turns, as in pass the parcel. And he evokes haiku's 17 syllables blowing through the world, detached from laws other than those of the seasons, which are in So they become these elements of a cosmos in its immediate form, the atmosphere, the coordinates of the Earth's orbit around the sun, he says. In this ascription, haiku becomes the aesthetic embodiment of something that's interested me for a long time about translation, a kind of de-owned intellectual property and an ethic of the what he would call in another seminar the vivre ensemble, the how to live together. Circulating, available, and non-exclusionary, it sutures the for me to the for everyone within an open structure of political sociality and textual cooperism. This haiku-inspired ethic foments a conscious rupture with the critical reading that in his own past practice, he really breaks from self here. He says there's no longer any collective systematic force that would allow me to present a meaningful synthesis of the discussion of literary works. I therefore gave up the idea of dealing with criticism, capital C, since it would only have been a dull and outmoded account. Henceforth, he will speak from, quote, from the canton of the desire to write, leaving the academic vocation behind him, along with literature as an institution. And this, I'll skip this because in the interest of time, but it's very strangely close to Harold Bloom's polemic in How Do We Read and Why, How to Read and Why, where he sort of, I think I'm a little unfair here, but I put them together in a kind of anti-theory boat at this moment, ushering in an era of personal criticism and valorizing the reader's direct, unmediated contact with the text and celebrating how a piece of writing speaks to me. And that's where I get to Michel Ciauli's Something Speaks to Me, with the subtitle, Where Criticism Begins. This is a book that answers the apostrophic call of the text and answers the reading's new calling. While it doesn't shy away from theoretical texts, it strives for a poetic criticism that would be, quote, more like a dance than an algorithm, and gives full voice to affect. The latter, as Anna Kornblue has argued in Immediacy, often crushes mediation in the interest of no-filter forms of direct expression or in-your-faceness, hostile to critical distance and susceptible to anti-theory positions on both left and right. This immediacy discourse is recognizable, and this is a bit of a cheap shot, but in popular self-help admonitions like, speak your truth, live your best life, you do you. For Kornblue, this Twitter-friendly, life-coached kind of immediacy produces what she calls pure vibe, a roving vibeology that rhapsodizes the immutability of domination and exonerates inertia. Ciauli's Something Speaks to Me does little to ward off this late capitalist vibeology and self-centrism. It's replete with sentences like, I must feel that meanings are in play, that what I read matters, which just means matters to me. Only when there is intimacy between me and a work, a passage, a line, a gesture, a tune, can I feel urged to do something about it. So you can see by the tone of my voice that this speaks to me factor makes me uncomfortable. And I think it imputes an autonomous agency and anthropomorphic vivacity to texts, and that's good. And you could say that imbued with poetic force or poetic freedom and poetic making, which are terms that he stresses along the way, that literature is empowered more than ever to activate the auto-effective élan vital of language, all good. But the downside is a post-critical, apolitical stance that romanticizes unlearning, or a learning that puts too much trust in the recoil from critical distrust and the hermeneutics of suspicion. At its worst, I think, Something Speaks to Me becomes a litmus test for what should be read or taught, aka a sovereign reading in a different guise, and one that looks to be all too compatible with a commercially engineered subjectivism jiggered by the likes and dislikes of cultural rating systems. All right, let's let's jump ahead to for whom is the theory reading destined now? If I'm trying to say there's still a place for it, where do we find that? Well, I found some of it in this very just published, now posthumously published, I guess, book by Fred Jameson, which is a transcript of of course that he did, a theory course that he gave at Duke um, in the last year of his life, called The Years of Theory, Post-War French Thought to the Present. And I read it as a preparation for a kind of theory exam that we may or may not take. It's theory mode d'emploi. The text is useful to teach with, even though, or perhaps because, the explications are indisciplined. They sometimes resemble a shaggy dog story, going off in different directions. And what is striking about this book is its immediacy. It's like a live recording of a mind at work, and in this sense reflects Jameson's career-long commitment to reading for the present, a grammar that's essentially present participial, or temporality that is pre-utopian. The propulsive storm called progress that buffets Benjamin's Angel of History is taken by Jameson to be a symptom of a something else, something of a narrative kind analogous to the unconscious. This insistence on narrative fantasies, which, quote, a collectivity entertains about its past and future, and which are easily dismissed as merely mythical, archetypal, and projective, are not to be taken lightly. For Jameson, falling back on a method of anagogic symptomatic reading proposed way back in The Political Unconscious, a text of 1981, the task is, quote, to detect and to reveal the outlines of some deeper and vaster narrative movement in which the groups of a given collectivity at a certain historical juncture anxiously interrogate their fate and explore it with hope or dread. Jameson's master narratives of the political unconscious, lost as the construct, exist nowhere in empirical form, but their reconstruction through fragmentary and symptomatic texts of dreams, values, behavior, verbal association, and the like, that's his phrase, affect critical mediations that navigate our relationship to historical time and enable some kind of grasp on historical change. Forms of texts and their readings are the chroniclers of historical mediation and change. They are what we read for, and for with an E, portents of bourgeois cultural revolution or the end of capitalism. So that's, in a sense, that's what theory reading is for Jameson, and I think for a number of critics who have continued to work very much in his mold. My concluding paragraph, sorry, it's been long. One of his most ardent readers is Xian Nai, who finds in his essay, The Aesthetics of Singularity, inspiration for her own book, Theory of the Gimmick, referencing postmodern works, quote, soaked in theory, like Tom McCarthy's Remainder and Zhu Bing's installation, Book from the Sky. Jameson had analyzed the postmodern transformation of the idea in art from, quote, universal concept to a historically isolated contrivance. This word contrivance is what she picks up on. This contrivance is the basis of what she calls gimmick theory. And she quotes Jameson here. This is Jameson. The dictionary tells us the word gimmick means any small device used secretly by a magician in performing a trick. It's a one-time device which must be thrown away once the trick, singularity, has been performed. This idea of the gimmick as disposable device is contradicted by the fact that gimmicks, as he says, are used over and over again. And that's the point for Nye, who theorizes gimmicks as forms of compulsory repetition like a, quote, over-repeated joke that's no longer funny, or a novelty with no consequences beyond its immediately vanishing moment, the outdated device that refuses to die. The gimmick is revealed to be a strange, one-time but forever hat trick that morphs into a political allegory of hellish presentism, kind of endless, pointless expenditure and consumption that underwrites capitalism and epitomizes the late capitalist aesthetic. A key characteristic of the gimmick is its self-defeat. As Nye observes of the word's effect on Jameson's exposition, it produces a hesitation even in his essay, highlighting similar uncertainties inherent to the form. Likeness between the singularity and gimmick is suggested and retracted. Then the retraction is itself retracted. And I will conclude here by saying that this retractivity, kind of coy, may be, in fact, a symptom of an endless dichotomization that yields oppositions ad infinitum, which on one level offers no hope of dialectical systemic transformation. It's just this endless repetition. But that the recursive form also loops back to critical reading, one that I haven't worked out in my own mind, but I think, it leads to ways of thinking or unthinking or trying to unthink anti-capitalism, and that allows you to listen in on your own political unconscious, even if you no longer know exactly what you're listening to or reading for. Thank you.